Witamy już na czwartej prelekcji trzeciego dnia Tygodnia Mózgu Maria Myśli na UMCS. Naszym prelegentem jest profesor Bernhard Sabel. Profesor Bernhard Sabel jest profesorem psychologii medycznej na Wydziale Medycznym Uniwersytetu Otto w Magdeburgu. Jego głównym obszarem badań jest plastyczność mózgu po uszkodzeniach oczu i mózgu ze szczególnym uwzględnieniem uszkodzeń układu wzrokowego, przywracania wzroku z treningiem behawioralnym i nieinwazyjną stymulacją prądem. Neuropsychologia i neurofizjologia uszkodzeń układu wzrokowego oraz obrazowanie funkcjonalne układu wzrokowego. Interesuje się również wykorzystaniem nanotechnologii do neuroobrazowania i dostarczania leków. Opublikował ponad 250 prac naukowych, 9 książek i 20 patentów. Profesor Sabel przedstawi wykład pod tytułem Space-Time in the Brain, Neuromodulation and Plasticity for Vision Restoration. Zapraszamy do zadawania pytań, na które profesor odpowie po wykładzie. Życzymy miłego słuchania. Welcome to the fourth lecture on the third day of the Brain Week Maria Thinking at UMCS. Our lecturer is Professor Bernhard Sabel. Professor Bernhard Sabel is a full professor of medical psychology and medical faculty University of Magdeburg. His main domain of research is brain plasticity after eye and brain lesions with focus on visual system damage, vision restoration with behavioral training, and non-invasive current stimulation, neuropsychology and neurophysiology of visual system damage, visual system functional imaging. He is also interested in nanotechnology for neuroimaging and drug delivery. He has published over 250 scientific papers, 9 books, and has 20 patents. Professor Sabel will give a lecture on space-time in the brain, neuromodulation, and plasticity for vision restoration. We invite you to ask questions which Professor will answer after the lecture. Enjoy listening.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It is my pleasure and honor at the same time to present to the students in Poland. And before I start my lecture, I just wanted to send you my sincere appreciation how to deal with the crisis in the Ukraine and be open and welcome to all the people who are in danger. And this is very well seen in Germany, how much effort is made by the nearby countries. And I just want to express my appreciation for this. The world is a network. And obviously, if a part of the world is not working, then the network will be affected. And that's the same with the brain. If the brain is functioning properly, then all the networks are under control and function works properly, like vision, hearing, speaking, memory, and so on. Today's lecture is about space-time in the brain. This is a concept which I was inspired by Albert Einstein, who, as you know, defined the relativity theory, in which one element is that space and time cannot be separated from each other, but that space and time are tightly linked, so that whatever happens in time is also a function of space and vice versa. I believe this is true for the brain as well, because it matters which information arrives in which part of the brain at a particular time or at some other time. And if it works properly in a synchronous way, that is, that the brain activity works in harmony, then this is a good situation for the mental function, such as vision, which is what we are interested in. So you can look upon the brain as a street map, like on Earth, like a street map, but whether or not a function is supported depends on which way information travels in that street or in that cable network. And I call this the brain wide web. Now, let us ask the question, well, how many cells have to be connected? And interestingly, the number is rather large. There are as many brain cells as there are planets in the galaxy. In fact, even more than that. And what makes it even more complicated is, unlike the galaxy, where the stars and the planets are not directly connected, in the brain, cells are connected, and each cell can have as many as 10,000 synapses. So now if you multiply all of this, the number of possibilities how information can travel is quite dramatic and highly complex. Nevertheless, we do know today that brain networks are and their function are the biological and physiological basis for our thoughts, for our feelings. And the networks can change very rapidly, which is what we have recently described. In fact, in millisecond speed. So the networks are not fixed and rigid like a street map, but they are more like the internet, where information can go to this server or that server, depending on the current situation, depending on the package of information that is to be transported and so on. So the path can vary, going right, left, whatever, it doesn't matter. As long as A goes to B, then the network is fine. The second point I would like to make is that vision is a highly subjective matter. It is not as objective as we always think. Something like if it's there, I see it, and if it's not there, or if I can't see it, it's not there. It is actually more complicated. So seeing is both an objective event, but also a highly subjective interpretation of the world out there. And this in turn is also ruled by emotions and by a cognitive processing. Now, of course, the students of psychology and neuroscience are quite aware that brain cells have been known for a long time, ever since the Golgi stain showed that they're actually separate units. And over the last 100-some years, the concept was to define the brain in terms of different territories that fulfill certain functions. So today we quite are aware of what's called the Brodmann map, meaning that certain areas like those in the back of the brain that support vision, area 17, 18, 19, or other areas such as area 41 and 42 that support hearing, tend to be localized in certain regions. So while they are localized, we should not think of them as only being localized there or only that area being involved as in a function, but we always have to see the global context of things. So if somebody makes a decision in territory on the right in the visual area, it doesn't mean that nobody else cares. It actually affects the whole network. And unfortunately, in today's world politics, we see what dramatic effects can happen when there is an obstruction of the network's function. Now, to illustrate this point a little bit, we can look at the brain as a very complex network that consists both of anatomical connections, that is the trillion of cells that have axons and that connects through synapses with other cells. But we have the functional connections here shown in this graph in blue. So if an information travels from A to B, it could go different paths. The same way when there is an accident in the street map and you drive the car, you will take a detour and you'll get to B. It takes you longer, but you'll get there. Now, to describe networks, one way to do this is to ask where are the main centers or the hubs of the network? Which areas in the brain are most important to synchronize the different functions that have to happen? So, for example, the government may synchronize the economy, or a bank may synchronize the cash flow from different customers, and computers certainly synchronize all the time. But who are the hubs? Who are the most important servers, if you will, or analysis units? Where are they in the brain? And how can one quantitatively describe that? Now, as I mentioned before, information can travel from A to B. So here you see on the left, this logo is actually a Spotify logo. When a signal is given, let's say by visual cortex, and the target is to go to frontal regions, you can see that it can go different routes. And so what matters is that to describe not only the network anatomically, but its functional architecture, and especially how this architecture can change over time. Now, an interesting example of how the brain is active all the time without you knowing or not knowing, and even without you having a control over it, is this movement illusion. If you look at this image, it looks as if there are wheels that are turning in different directions. In fact, they are stationary. I can prove that if you look at one of those on the side where you see the Y that sticks to the side. If you just keep looking at the Y, you see that actually these spots are stable. Or you can look at any other spot at any place. If you just fix one particular spot, you see that the wheel is actually not moving. So here you kind of see the network of the brain visually. You see how the network is making adjustments, trying to interpret the world that it sees, in this case, this particular illusion. So in this particular instance, you actually see more than there is. So the brain creates a reality of vision that is not out there, but it's inside your brain. The reverse situation is the famous example of selective attention. Some of you may know this, but if you don't, this is quite interesting to take a look at. And the task here is to look at the team that passes a basketball team with white t-shirts that passes a ball from one to each other. So I'll start the video and just pay attention to the task of counting how often the white team throws the ball.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla? This video is from research by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris and is copyrighted. It is available for use in talks, training, and teaching on DVDs from VisCog Productions. Learn more.
Okay, so what you can see from this video is here, you don't see something that's right in front of your nose. Now, unfortunately, we're not in an audience, so you can raise your hand if you counted right or if you saw the gorilla. But most people do not see the gorilla until they're instructed to pay attention to the gorilla. So here again, the brain makes a decision what it pays attention to. So the reality out there is not properly represented in your brain such that you notice it unless you get instructed. Now, to come back to the brain networks, as I mentioned before, they can adapt in millisecond ranges. And this is illustrated in an experiment where we simply ask normal human observers to press a button when they see a visual stimulus. The visual stimulus will be shown up here when we are at 0 milliseconds. So you can follow this number. This is minus 195 milliseconds. That is before the stimulus. Then the stimulus comes on, and then we look what happens to the network. What you see here is a top view, helicopter view on the brain, and the red dots are hubs. As I explained before, the areas of highest synchronization in the brain. And the lines indicate how these hubs connect to each other. And the video shows you now the time lapse of what it looks like in relation to the task and how the structure of the network can change. So here we go. Now the stimulus is on and off again. And the task is to push a button, which usually takes 300 to 400 milliseconds. Right now, the button is pushed. You see how attention is paid to it. and maybe how a decision is made. These connections, they rapidly change within milliseconds. This particular resolution was an 8 millisecond analysis. So the changes you see are based on 8 millisecond calculations. Let me repeat it. So now you can get another sort of sense of it. So normal brain function requires that the brain is able to rapidly change like that, because otherwise your reaction is too slow. You may not be able to integrate different functions like hearing and seeing. It's like an orchestra that needs to be coordinated during the processing. So fast functional network changes are the basis of our thinking, of perception, and even of emotions and feelings. And that their task is to connect different areas of the brain with each other, for example, vision. Now, what is quite surprising, and that astonished us a lot, is that in a visual task, none of the hubs is located in the visual cortex that is located at the back of the brain, here where the vision is shown. So one can think of these networks connecting major centers of the brain, but they're dominated, or the synchronization is mostly dominated by areas in the brain which are important for emotional processing. So vision, like other tasks, is heavily dependent on the emotional input, and it cannot be regarded as independent as an objective, non-emotional event. It is a highly emotional event. This is why I showed this little heart here. Now, how about function of the visual system and where information travels when we look at the human brain? Now, in the upper cartoon, you see how the visual pulses, which hit the retina in the back of the eye, how they travel along this optic nerve, optic tract, back to the visual cortex. And the way they travel is that when you look with two eyes, for example, at your computer screen, the left visual field is represented in both eyes, in the left eye here and in the right eye here. And the right visual field is also represented in both eyes. But so the circuit of the street map, if you will, is organized such way that everything that comes from this part of the visual world, when you look straight ahead, is processed by the opposite hemisphere, the visual cortex, and other areas as well, and vice versa. But when damage happens to the eye, to the optic nerve, or anywhere along this visual axis, all the way to the brain, it creates vision loss and blindness. And the fundamental concept is that blindness, once you get it, it's forever. And we believe that is actually wrong. The optimistic future, there is optimistic future, and there's much more that can be done. And we don't have to make patients afraid by saying you will go blind or you will remain blind forever. There is something that we can do. It is an old antique dogma that once you're blind, that's it. Now, blindness affects a lot of people, especially the elderly. Almost 20% of persons over 65 have low vision. And there are different diseases that create low vision, damage to the eye, to the nerve, or to the brain. And they include glaucoma, macular degeneration, diabetic retinopathy, optic nerve damage, retinitis pigmentosa, brain stroke and trauma, and even long COVID impairs visual processing. Now, the traditional old way, historic way of looking at visual fields, as I mentioned, is that once it's blind, that's it. For example, here, this patient has tunnel vision, can only see some sectors of the visual field. In this case, they call it tunnel vision, or they see only half of the visual field. When the visual cortex is damaged in one hemisphere, then if it's here, the damage is on the right hemisphere, so the visual field is lost in the left side. This old black and white view is actually too simple, because when patients are doing visual field tests. So this is called the visual field. How far out can you see stimuli? And when they do it in the doctor's office, you actually get this kind of image. This is an actual result. And that's quite different from what you see above. Above it's black and white, but down here it's shades of gray. So you have areas that are presumably intact. In fact, they have some small deficits. But then there are areas that are light and dark gray all the way up to black, where the patient didn't respond at all to the stimuli. So they're presumably blind. So we cannot speak of blind or not blind. We should speak of different shades of vision, or what we call residual vision. Now, residual vision is interesting because it is the area that is of greatest importance for us working in the field in medicine, because we want to help the patient. We don't want just to tell the patient, yeah, you can't do this or you can't do that. We want to tell them, well, here is something you may be able to do to improve your vision. And these gray areas, these partially damaged areas, I believe are the ones that have the best hope that we can do something. You know, gray is like an intermediate function. And when you ask yourself, when do I go to the hospital? Do you go to the hospital when you're healthy? Like here in the intact visual field? No, you don't. You also don't go to the hospital when you're dead. Yeah? For instance, if there are a lot of dead cells that you cannot revive and they can't be revived, then you don't go to the hospital either. You go to the hospital when you're sick, when you're partly functioning, but not functioning enough to go back home or back to work. So here we think that in these gray areas, there are cells that have survived, but they're desynchronized. They don't fire at the same time. Somehow they get confused, or they don't get enough oxygen, as if you're pushing the gas pedal on your Ferrari, but you're not getting any or not enough gas in your motor. Then your Ferrari can drive nowhere and you're stuck. The same way, cells can become inactive or active at times, depending on the current situation. Now, there are many influences that have an impact on how well patients then can see. For example, when they get in glaucoma treated for high eye pressure, intraocular pressure, IOP, it can improve vision. There is spontaneous recovery. That is, sometimes they see better and sometimes they see worse. They can learn to see better. There are spontaneous fluctuations caused by mental stress, by worries and anxiety, such as when they hear from their doctor, oh, you will go blind. The patient is very afraid. They think about it many times a day, and it creates stress, more stress and more stress, and that has a negative impact on vision. Or depression, fatigue, even time of day and atmospheric pressure, so weather dependent, and altitudinal influences. When you go high on the mountain, if you have a sensitive eye, that actually has an effect on your blood flow. Now, coming back to the brain, how can you explain such changes, and what can you plan about possible medical treatments taking advantage of the brain's network? To understand the importance of the brain, I want to point out that the weight of neuronal tissue in the retina, located in the eye, is only about 1, 2, or 3 grams. But the amount and weight of tissue that process visual information is several hundred grams, because that information that travels up the optic nerve and then to the visual cortex gets distributed throughout the brain and coordinated with different areas, as you saw in the network image before. And all of that needs to be synchronized. If there are no street traffic signs, the traffic will not be synchronized and will not work flawlessly. And it's the same with the brain. So it needs to be synchronized in the right way. And the synchronization here is mostly an issue of the time. Remember, space-time of the brain. You cannot only look who is active, but you have to ask who is active at what time and with whom does that area in the brain communicate at that moment. So let me illustrate this by showing 2 waves. And these are oscillations of neurophysiological activity in the brain. Let's say this is one simple sine wave that sends a signal. And then there's another signal that at the time when here the signal goes to sleep, this one is wide awake and active. And if the two of them are, one is active and the other is inactive, they don't meet, they don't synchronize. It's like two friends. Somebody sleeps and the other one is awake. And he says, where's my friend? And the one who sleeps doesn't even know about it. But if you slightly change the timing of this second, or of one of the waves, such that they match, and the peak of the activity is there at the same time. So both friends are awake at the same time, they can meet. Otherwise, they don't. And the result of it is that even though the activity is the same and both waves are there and the oscillations in the brain are functioning, but if they are not working together, then the sum of it, and in the brain things get summed up. If the sum of it in the desynchronized state is then 0, there is no function. But if they're well synchronized, you get a signal. Now translating this to the brain condition, here let's say a given patient has a visual impulse generated by the retina, which is then sent to the brain, but the brain is disorganized, the sum of which will then be below the perceptual threshold. That is, there may be some activity, but it's too small to be perceived consciously. However, in the case of synchronization or restoration of this condition, the same wave produced by the retina is then amplified by a synchronized brain, which is adding up to a sensible stimulation of the brain and therefore of conscious perception. So you can see this beautiful sunset now, whereas before you didn't, even though brain activity was the same, but the synchronization wasn't in tune. Now, to approach a brain damage and visual system damage and try finding ways to improve the synchronization state, we have been working for a number of years by giving electric pulses to patients and also to animals, to rats, but mostly to patients, to synchronize their brains and with the hope to improve their function. So the goal is, by giving a synchronized pulse, you can teach, so to speak, the brain how to get into sync again, similar to like an orchestra. You know, before the conductor comes on stage and everybody is sort of tuning the instruments or they're trying out some part of their score, you know, it sounds like noise. But as soon as the conductor comes on, everybody claps hands, the conductor holds the stick, and then they start. Then you have this beautiful music because they're all synchronizing in time. But the activity may be the same than when they practiced before. So that is accomplished with a small device we developed, a stimulator that gives current pulses to the brain via 2 electrodes, which is shown here on the bottom. So the electrodes are placed near the eye, and then patients are treated for 10 days at about half an hour each day with 2 milliamps. So they are very small microcurrents. You can hardly feel them. They are much below what the heart pacemaker produces. So they are very benign, no side effects. Now, first we wanted to know, well, where do they go, these currents, when you stimulate the brain like that? And of course, they go to the eye. That is pretty obvious. And then the current travels along the optic nerve, because current goes always along the path of least resistance, where there is the most water content. That's where the current goes. But it also goes through the skull and stimulating the frontal cortex. You can see here how the frontal cortex receives a current, and also the base of the brain. Now we look at the brain from the bottom. These are computer simulations. They are not actual measurements. You cannot actually measure current in the brain, but you can simulate it. You can see that the current spreads to the eye, the nerve, and frontal regions, and also travels along the base of the brain and shunts in the ground through the spinal cord. Now, the effect of that is quite dramatic. In normal subjects, when you record the network of the brain with EEG, electrophysiological recording, you can identify the major information highways in the brain. And in the normal subjects without any disease, you see that there seems to be sort of a connection from the back of the head to the front. This is the nose. So we're looking on the head from the top view. After damage of the optic nerve, you find here that this highway connection is lost. So these servers are disconnected, if you will. But after 10 days of treatment with alternating current, you see that there is in part, not completely, but in part, a restoration of the visual of these functional connections. Another effect, which is kind of a second effect that microcurrents produces, is they benefit the blood flow. down here, you see a stroke patient. This is the stroke area. Before therapy, this area did not have much oxygenation. This is collected with the 7 Tesla MRI. You see that there are some areas of blood flow, but it's not a lot. But if you see here, after the therapy, you see a significant improvement of blood flow in the brain. And even up here, you see that there are specks of blood flow that weren't here before. So as if the electricity enhances also the blood flow. We are not sure if it's only neuronal or only blood flow or the both. It's probably the combination and the interaction of both, which is called the neurovascular coupling. Now, the next video is a short presentation of a case of a patient who came to us for treatment in Magdeburg. It's about an 8-minute video.
Okay, we're going to start now. Here we go.
This is one of the most anxiety-provoking exercises a person can do. This machine, it's called a Humphrey, randomly blinks tiny lights, and I'm to click when I see one. The ones I miss measure my vision loss.
All those numbers there that you see that are zeros are blind spots. He doesn't see those areas.
You see, I have glaucoma, and I've been clicking for almost 20 years. You can see how the disease is robbing me of my sight. That was my vision a few years ago, when I first started making the film Going Blind. Since then, it has gotten worse. My vision often looks like it's seen through dirty glasses. Oncoming traffic at night gives me a blinding glare. My ability to read with my left eye is especially impaired.
Not as sharp, right?
This is the oven, not as sharp, but it's not sharp. I mean,
It's not crisp with this.
Yeah, maybe it's just not there.
That's just the way it's probably going to be.
In the United States, some treatments can slow or stop vision loss from optic nerve damage, but none can reverse it. However, I heard of a study in Magdeburg, a medieval German town about 2 hours from Berlin, where researchers are making strides in actually reversing vision loss. I decided to give it a try.
We have about 15 people here in the research group of different disciplines, and all of them focus more or less on the issue of restoring vision. We have most recently started work on non-invasive brain stimulation.
The work is based on 20 years of research done on thousands of patients at the Human Brain Institute in St. Petersburg, Russia. This is the concept. The optic nerve brings the data the eye senses to the brain, and the brain interprets that data as sight. But an optic nerve damaged by glaucoma brings less data back to the brain. With electric brain stimulation, the hope is to improve the brain's ability to interpret the data coming in through the damaged optic nerve. When I first arrived, we spent 2 days evaluating my vision, so we could compare results before and after. This included visual fields as well as EEGs to measure brainwaves. My visual fields show what vision I have left. The white is good, the black is gone, and the various shades of gray indicate what is called residual vision.
It's these areas of partial function, where vision is neither absent nor normal, that give us an opportunity for restoration and repair.
We got your data, and now we have some conclusion about it. Left eye, still central area seems to be clear, but surroundings much worse. But still we have some kind of gray dots. It means probably the islands will respond to the treatment first.
The treatment is the administration of alternating current. First, 4 electrodes are attached around my eyes. The current goes through my eye and optic nerve and into my brain. I detect a sense of movement. Then I see what appears to be light. This is called a phosphene effect. As the current increases, so does the clarity of the light. Okay.
Yeah, good.
Then he adjusts the frequency. The light starts to flicker, and he increases the frequency until the flickering stops. And then we're ready to go. For 20 to 40 minutes each day, the current is introduced to each electrode in a figure-8 pattern. And that's it.
It's about half of the patients who benefit from the therapy, and some that profit have marginal or less pronounced improvements, but there are others who have massive improvements.
Two weeks later, more evaluations, visual fields and EEGs. And then I find out which sort I'll be. Die Mutter der Marmelade ist die Quitte. Sie gab dem Brotaufstrich ihren Namen Portugiesisch Marmelo Quitte. What does that mean?
It means you can read.
That's pretty good. Even though I don't know what I'm saying, I can read it.
Yeah, exactly. And I would like to conclude that we got from your side during your examination good results, because not only you could read better and see better, but also your visual field now looks better, and it's significant. And here is your visual field charts, especially for your left eye. And before the therapy, you see mostly we have this central, this scotoma near your center, which affect to your central vision also. And after 10 sessions, brain stimulation, if you're looking for the central area, we see that centrally your visual field starts more clear. Exactly this defect area plus this area also can be explained in terms of improvement, because it practically seems to be like intact area. These changes help you to start to read again.
I'm happy to look at small changes. These are more than small. Wow. And there are other improvements. The smudginess of my vision has been corrected. When I check my glasses to see if they are dirty, they really are. Glare has been greatly diminished, especially from oncoming traffic and in airports. And my acuity has improved in both eyes. I still don't like my deficit, but I think exploring a new avenue has energized me and made me feel more optimistic about the different directions that people could go in research and the different ways that could be looked at in terms of attacking some of these issues of blindness. I think there's a lot of resignation in ophthalmology, and that's not a good thing.
Now it's time to change our thinking about how to treat brain functions. We should take advantage of the tremendous plasticity that the brain has. That's why it's great to get together with other collaborating research institutions to work together to shape the future of neurological treatment and therapy. And by doing so, we'll have new options available that never was thought of before, and that will give us an advantage of helping many, many patients in the years to come. Okay, I am back. Here is another example of a glaucoma patient's visual field. You see it's pretty dark, no white areas, and presumably there are some normal cells still, but many of them may be dead neurons. But after 10 days of therapy, you see that the visual field has improved. There are many more white areas and much less black. And our theory is that this change from 19% function to 63% function in this case, and this is an extreme case, can be explained by the reactivation of hypometabolic cells. These are cells that have survived. They are kind of in the hospital, in the intensive care unit, but they could be reactivated. These are not new cells. This is not regeneration. This is reactivation. Another example of this is this young man who was a victim of a terrorist attack in Munich. 3 Islamists followed him and said to him, you know, at the middle of the night when he returned home from a party, 2 o'clock in the morning, they were walking behind him and say, "Hey, are you a Nazi?" And the young man turned around and he says, "I'm not a Nazi, I'm a Jew." Now, he was a Jew, and that was not a good idea to say that, and they almost killed him. He was in a coma for many weeks, and when he woke up, he had different deficits, including vision loss. When he came to us, many of his functions improved and recovered spontaneously, like the speech or walking, but his eye had only 10% function. So this young student of economics, after this traumatic brain damage, improved after 10 days to some degree. So you see here, after 10 days is 15%. And then he did a bunch of exercises, we told him, and some things to observe when he goes home. And he came back about 3-4 months later to our clinic to check where is his vision. And this is where he ended up after 4 months. So this improvement from 10% to 73% is not small. This is a paradigm change showing that the visual system, which is damaged through plasticity of the brain, has a dramatic ability and potential to improve. Now, they are not all like that. These are extreme examples, and the response in patient varies considerably, and we are exploring what are the factors that influence this, and it seems that it's mostly stress and anxiety that is the block to optimize recovery. So patients that are kind of accepting the disease, they're not fighting it every day. They're not stressed out. They don't feel really traumatized, but they say, hey, look, you know, with one eye is also good. You know, with 2 eyes was luxury, but with 1 eye, I can do almost everything. If they have sort of a serene attitude, a more relaxed attitude, it really makes a difference to the recovery rate. And therefore, in our therapy in Magdeburg, we combine the microstimulation with relaxation techniques, meditation, eye yoga, and lifestyle recommendations, including some psychological considerations that are important for individual patients, especially. So the whole idea then, to sum up, is that it's possible to explain the recovery by a mechanism that involves both the neuronal activation, but also the vascular supply. And this is now shown in this cartoon. Under normal conditions, nerve cells send action potentials to the next cell. And when they do that, potassium is released during the action potential, you know, potassium out, chloride, sodium and chloride in, which is then sensed or recognized by the blood vessels. Blood vessels are highly sensitive to potassium, and there is an upstream signal. This is the blood flow. Blood flows this direction, but the signal goes upstream, so kind of to open up the valve, so more blood can flow, more oxygen, more nutrients can flow to the area that needs the energy right now. Kind of you're stepping on the gas pedal, and then the gas will flow and the motor will run, and you're running fast with your Ferrari on the highway. However, if the blood flow is compromised, for example, by mental stress, which then leads to vascular dysregulation, the flow is slowed, there's less flow. Even the diameter is thinner, which is not shown, but there are all kinds of toxic influences of this condition. And then the neuron doesn't get enough energy to fire signals. So it's hanging around, waiting to be woken up. And so how do we wake it up? We stimulate it with double punch technique. We trigger the neurons to fire, and we trigger dilation of the blood vessels with the electric current. So by repetitively giving microcurrent pulses in a synchronized way, this double punch, and you can't do it, you know, here this and here that, or only one, you actually have to do 2 at the same time. It dilates the blood vessels and the motor starts running again. And that way you can explain how recovery may be possible by way of reactivation of vascular supply. So brain plasticity, in other words, is not only a neuronal affair, it is also a vascular affair, or to be more precise, a neurovascular issue. Now I want to come slowly to an end. These diseases are the ones we treat in my private practice in Magdeburg, where patients come from all over the world. We also had some from Poland and from the Ukraine and from Russia and from the US and Canada and what have you. And the effects nowadays is that 84%, before I always said 50% of the patients improved. By now, with all these methods, we improved it to 84% outcome. But there are still patients who are non-responders. It's about 16%, which you see here. There are no side effects. The treatment effects last for a long time, not in all patients, but in most patients. And currently, the treatment is only available in Germany, in Magdeburg. Now, remember that the brain has a network that controls our thinking. And it's this network that has to function properly for visual function to work correctly. And all these different functions have to be integrated. And the key issue is the emotions. They are the ruler of it all. And I would like to use sort of this opportunity to maybe give some psychological advice to the young students, how to take care of their emotions and how important it is for the success of your work, of innovation, and also of plasticity. Now, the brain centers that control emotion, they are here in the so-called limbic system, one of which is the hippocampus, which is also considered to be a novelty center. It becomes active when you see something novel. So when you play on your cell phone and you always look in the internet, it's your hippocampus that says, I want more new information, new, with little work, but I get a lot of results. Now, good feelings generate passion. And this is kind of sort of a teacher's advice, if you will. What are generators of passion? What makes you work hard? And what is it that moves the world around? It's that you have a certain amount of self-confidence, but please, realistic self-confidence, not over-exaggerated. Nowadays, a lot of people, they think they can do everything, even though they can't. So a good self-confidence is helpful, not be too shy. Recognition and passing of credit to others, to your colleagues, to your boss, to your subordinates, to your family, certainly. Share the blame when mistakes are made and focus on your strengths. Do not focus on what you don't have and what your weaknesses are. And try to live or work in an innovative environment where people have the same kind of attitude. And here the perception of freedom is key to passion. If there is no freedom, there is no passion. The opposite is true. What kills innovation? What kills freedom? It's pressure, anxiety, and fear. A system that produces fear, a system that produces control, lack of appreciation is killing all incentives, motivations, and for innovations. They create anxiety and risk aversion. Everyone is afraid to make a mistake rather than thinking, oh, why don't we try? Pressure, worrying of losing the job or having to do something you don't want to do. Over control by others, by superiors. Too many evaluations, being tested all the time. You know, medical students can tell you their experience with that. And certainly inflated egos and the greed for power and for money. Company politics is a killer, and bad politics in general is a killer, and in the true sense of the word, as we now are reminded of. And companies won't work and systems don't work if power is more important than making the right decisions. That is the nature of the human mind. Now, in the words of Albert Einstein, and I'm circling back to him because he had some smart things to say that I thought were very cool. He says, don't be afraid to make mistakes. And the way he phrased it, anyone who has never made a mistake has never tried anything new. So with this quote, and by the way, Einstein had the same number of neurons, or similar number of neurons, but he had 10 times more glial cells. That's what they found out by looking at his brain. So I'd like to end the lecture with the take-home message, how to reprogram your brain, how to adapt and evolve to change. The first thing is no excuses. You have enough brain cells to adapt and evolve. So you can't say you can't do it. You have enough cells up there. You just have to use them. Reprogram your brain and become the master of your emotions, and don't become the slave of your emotions, that you're always triggered in your behavior by your emotional responses. Learn to relax. Less mental stress creates more efficiency. Worry less, and your brain will love you if you think positively and you're an optimist. It energizes and gives you a happy feeling. Finally, there are the usual lifestyle things that everyone probably knows about, how you can create creativity, innovation, and productivity, exercise, healthy food, less alcohol, and regular sleep, sex, and meditation. So dare to think differently, because no risk, no fun. This is what your brain needs. Your brain needs positive emotions. So all the synchronizing networks and all these trillions of cells can happily work together in a fashion that is harmony to the mind, like an orchestra that plays in sync. So with the megalanic cloud, I'd like to end by proposing, think about your brain wide web, get those trillion cells and synapse connections going, and maybe remember this quote from a fellow from the London School of Economics. In the past, jobs were about muscles. Now they are about the brain, and in the future, they will be about the heart. With that, I'd like to thank my team who helped me over so many years, many different disciplines, many different students, both at the University of Magdeburg and my clinical practice at the Xavier Center. And those of you interested in reading more about vision loss, feel free to get a book that I wrote that you can order on Amazon. It's available in English and in German. So thank you very much for your attention and for dedicating your brain cells to my lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting lecture and for giving us tips for reprogramming our brain. We have some questions from our audience. And the first one is, how permanent are the effects of ASS? Do patients have to come to regular sessions for stable improvement?
Okay, we recommend repeat treatments after 6 to 12 months. Most patients come back after 12 months. They are stable for many years. They can even improve after patients leave. They get better, sometimes better and better over time. So we're only starting a process that lasts up to 6 to 8 weeks. But when the brain starts using these areas, and then also there's less worry, it will be maintained. But as with the therapy effects, also the stability is variable between patients. So it is better to come regularly, but it's always an issue of time and money, obviously. But changing the lifestyle is the best thing you can do. Drink more, relax more, and enjoy life.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, do you consider installing intrusive under-skin stimulators for permanent synchronization?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat? I didn't fully understand.
Yes, so the question is if you consider installing intrusive under-skin stimulators for permanent synchronization.
Oh, yeah, no, I don't, because I'm not aware of any evidence for it. They do implantation of electrodes in the brain for Parkinson patients for diseases. But we have a home stimulation device that you can use non-invasively, several times a week, and that is much less invasive. So I have no reason to recommend it because it's easier the other way.
Okay, thank you. And the third question is, can plasticity described be as well enhanced by the increased activity of glial cells?
That I am not qualified to answer because I wouldn't have the right answer for it, but glial cells are certainly important in the network. But plasticity is mostly discussed in terms of synaptic plasticity and neurons. But since glial cells are also nerve cells, I presume that there is plasticity in the glial cells as well, but I'm not an expert on this.
Okay, understandable. And the last question from our audience is plasticity possible if the vascular supply was disinhibited for a longer time than just in TIA?
I think that plasticity is a fundamental principle of the human brain. It is maintained throughout life. Plasticity is possible even if there is a longer term deficit. There are the most extreme examples I can think of is coma patients who are in coma for many years and all of a sudden they wake up. There are such cases in the literature and there are credible reports. Our therapy to improve plasticity with microcurrents is also effective, independent of how long or how old the lesion is and how long ago the disease started. So plasticity is the very nature of the brain. In fact, the brain is a plasticity organ because it changes the networks all the time, and that ability is of course there. But it may be less in diseases like dementia or others, but it certainly is a fundamental feature that's always there. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Hopefully for all of us, often most of the time, yeah, of course.
Okay, once again, thank you for such an interesting lecture. And for our audience, we see you at the last lecture today at 10, 6 and 10, yeah. So thank you and see you.
Okay, thank you very much. Enjoy your day. Bye-bye.